In the winter months of 1959, a group of 9 young, experienced hikers began their journey into the Ural Mountains of Russia.
9 hikers went into the Ural Mountains. None came back. For 60 years, the Dyatlov Pass incident was a graveyard of wild theories, from secret Soviet nukes to literal monsters. But the mystery wasn't unsolvable. We just didn't have the right eyes. Now, thanks to cutting-edge AI 3D mapping and digital forensic scans, the mountain is finally giving up its secrets. What the data reveals isn't just a theory. It's a terrifying, frame-by-frame reconstruction of their final night, the night of the incident. Imagine 9 of the toughest, most experienced hikers in the Soviet Union. These weren't tourists. They were seasoned trekkers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, led by Igor Dyatlov. They were heading into the heart of the Mountain of the Dead, a place where the wind doesn't just blow, it screams. It was February 1959, a time when the world was silent, cold, and divided. They set up camp on a slope called Kholat Shyakhl, a decision that has baffled experts for decades. Why pitch a tent on an exposed, wind-whipped ridge instead of down in the tree line where there was shelter and wood for fire? It was a tactical error that would set the stage for one of history's most terrifying cold cases. The diary entries from the group were upbeat, even playful. They were eating, joking about snowmen, and preparing for sleep. Then, something happened. Something so sudden and so violent that it bypassed the logical survival instincts of these trained outdoorsmen. In the middle of a sub-zero night, they didn't unzip the tent. They slashed it. They used knives to hack through the canvas from the inside out, desperate to escape. They didn't grab their boots. They didn't grab their coats. They bolted out into the pitch-black Siberian night, some in nothing but socks, others completely barefoot, into temperatures reaching -30 Celsius. The scene the search party found weeks later looked like a surrealist painting. The tent was buried in snow, flattened and shredded. Footprints, 9 sets of them, led away in a neat, orderly line toward the woods. This is the first detail that breaks your brain. They weren't running in a panic. They were walking. Imagine the sheer willpower required to walk calmly into a frozen void while your feet are literally freezing to the ground. They headed toward a massive cedar tree about a mile downslope. It was there, under that tree, where the true horror began to reveal itself. The first 2 bodies found were Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. They were dressed only in underwear. Their hands were burned, and skin was found embedded in the bark of the cedar, suggesting they had tried to climb it so desperately they tore their own flesh off. Why? Were they hiding from something on the ground, or were they trying to spot the tent they had just abandoned? Nearby, the searchers found Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin. They were spaced out along the path back to the tent, frozen in positions that suggested they were trying to crawl back to safety before the cold claimed them. But the real nightmare was still hidden. It took another 2 months, as the spring thaw began, to find the remaining 4 hikers. They were buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine further into the woods. These weren't just victims of the cold. They were victims of a physical force so massive it mirrored the impact of a high-speed car crash. This is where the story shifts from a tragic accident to a dark conspiracy. How do you get crushed ribs and fractured skulls without a single bruise on the skin? How do you lose your eyes and tongue while your clothes show traces of mysterious radiation? The Soviet investigators at the time were stumped. They closed the case with a phrase that has haunted the internet for 60 years: an unknown, compelling force. It was a legal way of saying, "We have no idea, and we're done looking." The files were shoved into a secret archive, the area was cordoned off, and the legend of Dyatlov Pass was born. But the footprints told a different story. The impossible injuries. If the sight of frozen bodies wasn't enough to rattle the Soviet investigators, the autopsy reports certainly were. This is where the Dyatlov mystery shifts from a tragic survival story into something that feels like a dark science fiction horror. When the first 5 bodies were found, the cause of death was officially listed as hypothermia. It made sense. If you run out into a Siberian blizzard without boots, the cold is going to win every single time. But when the snow melted and the final 4 hikers were pulled from that ravine in May, the narrative broke wide open. These weren't just frozen people, they were broken people. Take Nikolai Thibault Brignol. His skull had been subjected to a massive force, resulting in a fracture so severe that bone fragments were driven into his brain. Then there were Dubinina and Zolotaryov. They both had symmetric rib fractures, cracks on both sides of their chests caused by a pressure so intense it was comparable to being hit by a car traveling at 60 miles per hour. Yet, here is the kicker. There were no external bruises. Their skin looked fine, but their internal skeletons were shattered. In a 1959 forensic lab, this was impossible to explain. How do you crush a man's chest without leaving a mark on his chest? Then the details got even more gruesome and, frankly, bizarre. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, her soft palate, and her eyes. Semen Zolotaryov was also missing his eyes. For decades, people pointed to this as evidence of something ritualistic or predatory. Was it the local Mansi tribesmen? Was it a cult? Or was it something not of this world? While modern skeptics often point to small scavengers or natural decomposition in a wet environment, the sheer targeted nature of the trauma fueled the fire of a cover-up for over half a century. It felt like someone or something had harvested these parts. To add another layer of weirdness, the investigators brought out the Geiger counters. They tested the clothing of the victims found in the ravine and found elevated levels of beta radiation. In the middle of the Cold War, radiation was a word that triggered immediate panic and military intervention. Why would hikers in the middle of nowhere be contaminated with radioactive dust? The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, even noted that their skin had a strange orange tan, despite being dead in the dark for months. He eventually admitted in private interviews years later that he suspected UFOs but was ordered by high-ranking officials to shut the case down and classify the findings. The medical anomalies created a vacuum that was quickly filled by the wildest theories imaginable. The trauma was too high impact for a simple fall, yet too localized for a typical avalanche. The hikers were also found to be wearing mixed clothing, meaning they were swapping clothes in their final moments, a sign of desperate survival or perhaps a chaotic struggle in the dark. We were left with a puzzle where the pieces didn't just fail to fit, they seemed to belong to entirely different puzzles. For 60 years, the compelling force was the only answer we had for how 9 healthy athletes could be pulverized and irradiated on a lonely slope. The math didn't add up. Until now, the rabbit hole of theories. When logic fails, the imagination takes over. And for 60 years, the Dyatlov Pass incident has been the ultimate playground for the unexplained. Because the Soviet government slammed the door shut on the investigation so quickly, the public was left to stitch together their own explanations. The first and most grounded theory involved the local Mansi people. People wondered if the hikers had accidentally stumbled onto sacred ground or a shamanic site, leading to a violent confrontation. But the evidence didn't support a massacre. There were no signs of a struggle with other humans, no weapon marks, and most importantly, no extra sets of footprints in the snow. As the Cold War escalated, the theories shifted from the mystical to the military. This is where the story gets really gritty. People began to whisper about plasmids or secret Soviet parachute mines. The Ural Mountains were, after all, a massive testing ground for the USSR's most experimental tech. Proponents of this theory point to the strange orange spheres reported by other hikers in the area that same night. They suggest that a low-altitude explosion or a failed rocket launch could have released a concussive shockwave, explaining the crushed ribs without external bruising and the radiation found on the clothes. It would also explain why the military took over the search and why the files remained classified for so long. Then, things got weird. We're talking Yeti weird. Some theorists became convinced that the hikers were hunted by a menk, the Siberian version of Bigfoot. They pointed to a blurry photo found on one of the hikers' cameras as proof of a massive, hairy figure lurking in the trees. The theory goes that the menk attacked the tent, causing the group to flee in terror, and then systematically hunted them down in the ravine. It's a terrifying thought, but it lacks any physical evidence like hair samples or DNA. Still, it remains a favorite for those who believe the injuries were just too animalistic and brutal to be caused by mere snow and ice. Of course, we can't talk about a 50s mystery without mentioning aliens. The orange spheres mentioned by witnesses were often interpreted as UFOs. Some believed the hikers were part of a botched abduction, or were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when an extraterrestrial craft made an emergency landing. The missing eyes and tongues were compared to modern cattle mutilations, which often feature surgical precision and a lack of blood. While it sounds like a plot from The X-Files, for a long time it was as good an explanation as any other, given that the official version was basically a blank page. Even the most natural explanation, a standard avalanche, was widely dismissed by experts at the time. The slope of Kholat Syakhl was considered too shallow, and there was no evidence of a massive debris field. If it wasn't a slide, and it wasn't a monster, and the military wasn't owning up to it, we were left in a perpetual loop of what-ifs. We were stuck in a cycle of ghost stories and conspiracy vlogs, waiting for a piece of evidence that wasn't colored by Cold War paranoia or folklore. We needed a way to see through time, to look at that mountain not as a legend, but as a data set. Enter the laser scanners, the tech revolution. For over half a century, we were trying to solve a 3D crime scene using 2D snapshots and fuzzy memories. But in the last few years, the game changed. Scientists didn't just go back to the mountain. They brought the mountain back with them in the form of pure data. Using a combination of high-resolution LiDAR, which is essentially light radar, and advanced photogrammetry, researchers have created a digital twin of Kholat Syakhl. This isn't just a map, it's a hyper-accurate, millimeter-perfect virtual reconstruction of the slope exactly as it was in 1959. By feeding historical weather data and snow depth records into AI models, they were able to hit rewind on the entire disaster. LiDAR is the same tech autonomous cars use to see the world, and when applied to the Dyatlov Pass, it revealed something the original investigators missed. The human eye sees a relatively flat, gentle slope, but the laser scans detected subtle hidden undulations in the topography, small shelves and dips that could trap snow in ways nobody realized. This tech allowed researchers to simulate the exact physics of the snowpack on the night of February 1st. They weren't guessing anymore. They were running trillions of calculations to see how weight, gravity, and wind interacted with the specific spot where Dyatlov's team cut into the ridge. Then came the AI-driven forensic animation. Modern Hollywood-grade physics engines, the kind used to make snow look real in movies like Frozen, were repurposed for forensic science. Researchers from the EPFL in Switzerland took the 3D terrain data and applied small-scale slab mechanics to it. They realized that by cutting a ledge into the slope to pitch their tent, the hikers had inadvertently removed the footer of a massive, heavy slab of wind-packed snow. The AI showed that it wouldn't take a massive mountain-moving avalanche to cause a catastrophe. It only took a block of snow the size of a dinner table moving at a specific velocity to change everything. This digital approach also debunked the radiation mystery without needing aliens. By scanning the surrounding geology, researchers identified high concentrations of thorium and potassium in the local granite. When combined with the digital twin of the hikers' movements, they could track how natural radioactive dust could have accumulated on their clothes during their trek. The AI didn't just look for monsters. It looked for the most boring, logical explanations that were previously invisible to the naked eye. It turned the Mountain of the Dead into a laboratory, stripping away the ghost stories and replacing them with cold, hard geometry. Perhaps the most impressive part of this tech revolution is the human element simulation. By using 3D motion capture and ergonomic modeling, scientists could simulate how a body reacts when hit by a specific mass of snow while lying down. They could see the exact angle required to snap a rib without bruising the skin, a phenomenon known as non-penetrating blunt force trauma that occurs when pressure is applied slowly but with massive weight. The 3D scans proved that you didn't need a car crash. You just needed a few hundred pounds of dense, creeping snow to pancake a human chest against a frozen floor. The tech didn't just give us a better picture, it gave us a time machine. It allowed us to sit inside that tent with Dyatlov and feel the mountain shifting above us. It moved the conversation away from who did this to how did physics do this? We were finally moving past the campfire stories and into a realm where every fracture and every footprint had a mathematical reason for existing. The mystery was being dismantled piece by piece by a swarm of digital points. The physics of the small avalanche were finally coming into focus. The physics of the small avalanche. For years, the avalanche theory was the laughingstock of Dyatlov investigators. Critics pointed out that the slope was too shallow, only about 23 to 26 degrees, and that there was no debris field or massive pile of snow found by the rescuers. If an avalanche had hit them, shouldn't the tent be buried a mile down the hill? This is where the 3D scans changed the game. The AI models revealed that Kolat-Syakhl doesn't produce the kind of white wave avalanches you see in action movies. Instead, it creates something much more surgical and sinister, a small-scale slab avalanche. It's a phenomenon that behaves less like a wave and more like a heavy ceiling collapsing. When the hikers dug into the slope to level the ground for their tent, they committed a fatal, invisible error. They cut into a layer of depth hoar, a fragile, grainy base layer of snow that acts like ball bearings. Above that layer was a massive, heavy slab of wind-packed snow ice that had been building up for weeks. By cutting the base, they effectively pulled the rug out from under a heavy frozen roof. The 3D simulations showed that it didn't happen immediately. It took hours for the wind to pile just enough extra weight on top for the tension to reach a breaking point. Around midnight, the slab finally snapped. The AI reconstruction shows a block of snow, likely several meters long and very dense, sliding just a few feet. It didn't need to travel far to be lethal. Because the hikers were lying down in their sleeping bags, they were trapped between the hard, frozen ground and the weight of the descending slab. Think of it like a giant, icy hand pressing down on a cardboard box. This explains the impossible injuries perfectly. The pressure was distributed across their entire torsos, snapping ribs and fracturing skulls through the soft padding of their clothes and sleeping bags. It was a static load injury, high pressure, low velocity, which is why there were no external bruises or impact marks. This digital breakthrough solved the biggest hurdle: why they left the tent. The hikers didn't flee because of a monster. They fled because they were being crushed alive. They used their knives to slash the tent, not just to get out, but to breathe. Once outside, the 3D weather modeling suggests they were met with a terrifying reality. A katabatic wind was screaming down the mountain at nearly hurricane speeds. In the dark, with their tent partially buried and several of their friends severely injured, they made a calculated, desperate choice. They couldn't stay on the exposed ridge in that wind. They would flash freeze in minutes. The data shows that they likely headed for the woods not in a blind panic, but as a tactical retreat to find shelter and build a fire. They hoped to survive the night and return for their gear when the sun came up. But the AI doesn't just track snow, it tracks calories and heat loss. It showed that once they were barefoot and injured in those conditions, their survival clock was ticking down much faster than they realized. The 3D scans of the terrain between the tent and the cedar tree revealed a treacherous path of hidden rocks and ice-filled gullies. Every step was a gamble they were destined to lose. The physics was finally ironclad. The compelling force wasn't a secret weapon. It was the simple, brutal weight of the mountain itself. But while the avalanche explained the broken bones, it didn't explain the psychological state of the group. It didn't explain why some of them seemed to go mad before the end. To understand the terror in their minds, the researchers had to look at something even more invisible than a snow slab: the sound of the wind itself. The infrasound factor was the final piece of the mental puzzle. The infrasound factor. While the 3D scans solved the how of the injuries, there was still a lingering why that haunted the case. Specifically, why did these elite hikers, even after a localized avalanche, seem to make such erratic, almost suicidal decisions? Why walk a mile away from your only source of survival in your socks? This is where the AI's mapping of the mountain's unique topography revealed a hidden psychological killer: infrasound. By creating a digital model of the surrounding peaks, researchers were able to simulate how the wind interacted with the specific shape of Kholat au Siakhl. They discovered that the mountain acts as a massive natural organ pipe. Infrasound consists of low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing, usually under 20 hertz. You can't hear it, but your body can definitely feel it. When wind rushes over a specific dome-shaped peak like Kholat Siakhl, it can create Kármán vortex streets. These are essentially spinning whirlpools of air that emit a constant, low-frequency hum. The 3D data showed that on the night of the incident, the wind conditions were perfect for generating intense levels of this silent vibration. In humans, exposure to high-intensity infrasound is documented to cause a cascade of dread. It triggers the fight-or-flight response, nausea, blurred vision, and a sense of overwhelming, inexplicable terror. Imagine being inside that tent, already exhausted and cold. Suddenly, your body is being bombarded by a frequency that vibrates your internal organs. You start to feel an impending sense of doom. You might see shadow people out of the corner of your eye, because the vibration can actually cause your eyeballs to resonate, distorting your peripheral vision. To the hikers, it wouldn't have felt like wind. It would have felt like the mountain itself was alive and hostile. This creates a state of auditory madness, where the brain desperately tries to find a source for the fear, making any small noise sound like a monster or an explosion. When the slab avalanche finally cracked the tent, the group wasn't just reacting to the snow. They were likely already in the middle of a massive, infrasound-induced panic attack. The AI modeling suggests that this sensory overload is why they didn't stop to grab their boots or coats. Their brains were screaming at them to get away from the sight of the terror. The digital reconstruction of the wind patterns shows that as they moved down toward the tree line, the topography changed, and the infrasound would have faded. By the time they reached the cedar tree, their heads might have cleared, but by then, the hypothermia had already started to settle in. This theory bridges the gap between the usual natural disaster and the wild paranormal stories. It explains why the hikers acted like they were being hunted by ghosts, because, in a way, they were. They were being hunted by a physical phenomenon that science only recently began to understand. The 3D scans proved that the Mountain of the Dead wasn't just a place where you could die from the cold. It was a place where the geography itself could trick your mind into making fatal mistakes. It was a perfect storm of physical pressure and psychological warfare, all choreographed by the shape of the land. With the physics of the snow and the biology of the sound finally mapped out, the AI was ready for the final task. It was time to stitch every data point together into a single, cohesive timeline. We could finally watch the final hours play out, not as a collection of theories, but as a tragic, inevitable sequence of events. The final sequence was ready to be rendered. The final sequence. With every variable plugged into the engine, the 3D terrain, the slab mechanics, the infrasound pockets, and the forensic data, the AI finally rendered the most likely version of that night. It's a tragedy in 3 acts. Act 1 begins at roughly 7 p.m. The hikers, exhausted from a grueling day, finish their meal and crawl into their sleeping bags. The wind is howling outside, vibrating the tent in a way that triggers that low-frequency infrasound dread. They are uneasy, but they stay put. Then, at some point near midnight, the footer they cut into the slope finally gives way. A massive, dense block of snow slides just a few meters, slamming into the tent with the weight of a falling wall. In the 3D reconstruction, we see the impact. Thibaut Brignol, Zolotaryov, and Dubinina are caught directly under the slab. Their bones snap under the static pressure, but because they are insulated by thick clothing and down sleeping bags, there is no blood, no open wounds, just internal devastation. The group is plunged into a nightmare. They are pinned under a heavy, suffocating mass in total darkness. Using their knives, those who can move hack through the canvas to reach the air. They drag their broken friends out into a blizzard so fierce they can't see their own hands. They are barefoot, the tent is ruined, and the mountain is still screaming with infrasound. The second act is a desperate tactical retreat. The 3D map shows them moving toward the woods, not in a chaotic sprint, but in a conscious line. They are trying to save the injured. They reach the large cedar tree and attempt to build a fire, but the wood is damp and the wind is too strong. The AI's thermal simulation shows that at -30°C with high winds, a person in light clothing loses consciousness in less than 30 minutes. This is where the group splits. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin decide they have to risk everything to get back to the tent for their supplies. They begin the long crawl back up the hill, but one by one, the cold shuts their hearts down. The final act takes place in the ravine. The 4 remaining hikers, including those with the most severe injuries, realize the fire isn't enough. They dig a hole in the snow, a snow den, to try and trap what little body heat they have left. They even take clothes from their dead friends under the cedar tree to try and stay warm. But the 3D scans show they were standing on a fragile snow bridge over a creek. As they huddle together, the bridge collapses, dropping them several meters onto the hard rocks below. This second fall explains the final ravine injuries and why they were found buried so deep. As they lay in the dark, the end comes quickly. The missing eyes and tongues. The AI points to the fact that they were in a wet environment with moving water and small scavengers, birds and rodents that target soft tissues first. The radiation? Natural mineral dust from the gorge. The orange tan? A standard byproduct of mummification in freezing dry winds. By 4 a.m., the mountain of the dead is silent once again. The compelling force wasn't a monster or a missile. It was a cascading series of natural events, each one triggered by a previous stroke of bad luck. The 3D scans have stripped away the ghosts, leaving us with something much more grounded and, in many ways, much more heartbreaking. It wasn't a secret war or an alien invasion. It was 9 young people doing everything right and still losing to a mountain that didn't care they were there. The ghost in the machine has spoken. The ghost in the machine. As the 3D scans finally decode the data, we're forced to face a colder reality. The AI didn't find a monster. It found a perfect storm of physics. It found that nature doesn't need a motive to be terrifying. It just needs a 23-degree slope, a slab of wind-packed snow, and a sound frequency that makes the human heart skip a beat. There's a certain melancholy in solving a mystery like this. By stripping away the controversial theories, we lose the legend, but we finally find the people. These weren't characters in a horror film. They were 9 friends who fought for each other until the very last second. The 3D reconstructions don't just show us how they died, they show us how hard they lived. They show a group of hikers who, even when broken and freezing, tried to build shelters, share clothes, and crawl back to safety against impossible odds. We no longer have to look at those grainy black and white photos and wonder, what if? We can look at the data and see the truth. Thank you for sticking until the end. Subscribe to our channel for more content like this.